In the spring of 2002, Wall Street pulsed with relentless energy. Traders shouted across crowded floors, briefcases clicked against marble, and the towers of Lower Manhattan stood as monuments to resilience in a city still reeling from tragedy. It was a place where every second meant money, where the unexpected usually came in the form of market crashes, not human blood. Yet one morning, the unthinkable happened. A promising financial professional was found murdered in a stairwell just steps from the beating heart of America's financial capital. The crime stunned colleagues and rattled a community that believed itself insulated by power and wealth. Years turned into decades, the case growing colder with each unanswered question, until a stunning breakthrough shattered the silence. And yet, one haunting truth remained. How could such a brutal crime remain unsolved for so long in the very shadow of Wall Street itself? In 2002, New York City was still learning how to breathe again. Only months had passed since the skyline was forever altered, and the scars of September 11th lingered in the streets, the subways, even the air. Yet in Lower Manhattan, the financial district pressed forward, determined to project an image of resilience. Wall Street's steel and glass towers gleamed defiantly, symbols of endurance for a city desperate to prove it could not be broken. Suits hurried past construction sites where dust still clung to sidewalks, and the clamor of trading floors once again echoed through high-rise corridors. To many, the return of financial normalcy felt like proof of recovery. But beneath that veneer of strength, tension simmered. Fear and uncertainty had already reshaped the city's psyche. And then came the murder. A life violently stolen, not in some shadowed alley, but in the very core of America's financial power. It was more than a personal tragedy. It was a breach of trust, an intrusion into a space that represented security and order. The case captured headlines briefly before fading into the city's relentless cycle of crises, but for those closest to the victim, the wound never closed. This was not just another statistic. It was a reminder that even here, in the towers meant to symbolize progress and permanence, darkness could seep through the cracks. Years later, the revelation of who was responsible and how justice was delayed for so long would force New Yorkers to confront a more unsettling truth. Resilience can coexist with neglect, and beneath the surface of progress, secrets can fester for decades. Before headlines reduced him to a case number and court files labeled him the decedent, he was simply Daniel Mercer. At 32, Daniel was the kind of professional who kept Wall Street's massive machine running, an associate at a respected firm, diligent and quietly ambitious. He wasn't one of the high-profile power brokers whose names appeared in financial columns, but colleagues knew him as reliable, sharp, and dependable under pressure. He arrived early, left late, and believed every small step could inch him closer to a brighter future. Yet work was only part of his story. Daniel's friends remembered his quick laugh, the way he carried conversations with genuine curiosity. After long hours, he often unwound at a neighborhood jazz bar in Tribeca, where the dim lights and saxophone riffs offered escape from the sterile glow of trading screens. Music, he once told a friend, kept him human in a world that too often reduced people to numbers. Family ties grounded him. Raised in Queens by immigrant parents who had sacrificed so much, Daniel carried their values of persistence and humility. Every Sunday, he took the subway back home for dinner, never missing his mother's roast chicken or his father's retelling of old family stories. His younger sister recalled how he never arrived empty-handed, always flowers for his mom, always a small toy for his niece. But there were vulnerabilities too. Colleagues noticed he sometimes shouldered more than he needed to, reluctant to delegate. Friends quietly worried about the toll of long hours and relentless stress. He had ended a serious relationship months before his death, and though he rarely spoke about it, his sister later admitted she saw a certain loneliness in his eyes. Daniel's world was rich, layered, and deeply human. When his life was stolen, it wasn't just a career cut short. It was laughter silenced, family rituals disrupted, and an entire future denied. To understand the gravity of what happened on Wall Street in 2002, one must first understand Daniel not as a victim, but as a man whose story deserved far more than an ending written in violence. On the night of March 14th, 2002, Daniel Mercer's routine seemed unremarkable, the kind of evening countless professionals in Lower Manhattan lived every day. He wrapped up work later than usual, sifting through spreadsheets under the dim office glow. Security logs marked him leaving the 32nd floor just after 9:15 p.m., swiping his badge with his usual precision. Surveillance footage showed him stepping out of the elevator into the marble lobby, coat slung over one arm, phone pressed to his ear. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. That call was to his sister. She later recalled that he sounded tired but light-hearted, joking about their father's stubbornness and promising to visit over the weekend. It was the kind of brief, everyday conversation families take for granted, but it was also the last time she would ever hear his voice. Afterward, Daniel stopped at his desk again, something colleagues noticed later while piecing together his timeline. A coworker working late remembered hearing his footsteps, the shuffle of papers, a muttered sigh. He seemed preoccupied, though not alarmed. Around 9:40 p.m., another surveillance camera caught him entering the stairwell, a shortcut he sometimes used rather than waiting for the elevator. And then, the story fragments. Somewhere between the 28th and 22nd floors, Daniel encountered someone who exactly would remain a mystery for decades. Witness accounts conflicted. A janitor thought he heard raised voices. Another employee reported seeing a shadow dart into the stairwell but dismissed it as nothing unusual. Phone records showed Daniel tried to make a call at 9:47 p.m. The number dialed, but never connected. When he failed to return home, family assumed he had stayed late, perhaps gone out with colleagues. But by morning, alarm bells rang. His desk still held his briefcase, and his coat had been found draped over a chair. Security officers began reviewing tapes. At 7:30 a.m., a maintenance worker unlocked the stairwell door to begin his shift. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. Daniel lay motionless between the 23rd and 24th floors, his body contorted against the cold concrete. The scene bore marks of violence too brutal to dismiss as accident. Defensive wounds across his hands, blood spattered against the wall, his watch shattered beside him. The sterile stairwell, usually filled with the hum of fluorescent lights and the echo of footsteps, became the stage for horror. Word spread quickly. Police swarmed the high-rise, tape cordoning off the building's arteries. Workers whispered in hallways, staring at the sealed stairwell door as if it were a wound carved into the building itself. Reporters gathered outside, cameras flashing against steel and glass. For Daniel's family, the discovery was a shattering intrusion. His mother, summoned by a trembling phone call, collapsed before she could even process the words. Colleagues struggled to reconcile the ordinary man they knew with the violence of his end. What began as an ordinary night had spiraled into tragedy in the very heart of Wall Street. The questions began immediately. Who had been with Daniel in those final minutes? Why had his last call failed? And how could such a brutal crime unfold, undetected, inside a building guarded by cameras, security, and constant movement? The answers would not come quickly. That night, the stairwell became a silent witness, its walls absorbing secrets that would remain hidden for decades. When Daniel failed to return home that night, his family's concern began with something ordinary: unanswered calls. His sister dialed 3 times, then 4, each ring echoing into silence. By morning, worry hardened into panic. Daniel was responsible, predictable. He didn't disappear without explanation. When his office called to confirm he hadn't shown up, the truth pressed down like a weight too heavy to deny. Something was wrong. Inside the Wall Street Tower, chaos unfolded. Police sealed off entrances, their radios crackling with hurried codes. Employees arriving for work found themselves held back by barricades, whispering as word spread that a body had been found in the stairwell. For many, disbelief carried them through the first hours. How could such violence happen in one of the most secure buildings in New York? Yet disbelief soon curdled into dread. Detectives moved quickly, but early theories only deepened the confusion. Was it a robbery gone wrong? Daniel's wallet was missing, but his watch, shattered, bloodied, lay near his body. Could it have been a personal vendetta, some buried grievance brought to the surface? Or worse, Given the fragile context of 2002, was this a terror-linked killing designed to destabilize morale in an already wounded city? Every possibility seemed equally plausible and equally horrifying. For Daniel's colleagues, shock bled into fear. Some whispered about late-night rivalries, others about financial secrets too valuable to risk exposure. Every rumor carried its own sharp edge. The building's stairwell, once a mundane passage, became a symbol of vulnerability. Meanwhile, Daniel's family faced the unbearable task of absorbing the news. His mother wept inconsolably, his father stood silent, and his sister replayed their final conversation until the memory became unbearable. The tragedy was not abstract, it was their son, their brother, stripped of a future. The city had grown accustomed to grief, but this was different. In a place built on order, money, and power, the randomness of such brutality shook faith in the very idea of safety. And for investigators, the first 24 hours only raised more questions than answers. The NYPD moved quickly to secure the scene, dispatching homicide detectives from Manhattan's south. At first glance, the murder of a young Wall Street professional seemed like the kind of high-profile case that would command immediate attention. Yet almost as soon as the investigation began, the machinery of bureaucracy slowed it to a crawl. Detectives canvassed the building, questioning anyone who had been present that night. But accounts conflicted. A janitor insisted he heard raised voices echoing in the stairwell, though others swore the floor had been silent. One coworker described Daniel as distracted earlier in the evening, while another insisted he seemed upbeat, even cheerful. The building's security cameras, touted as state-of-the-art, proved frustratingly limited. Grainy images, blind spots in stairwells, timestamps misaligned by several minutes. Every potential lead seemed to dissolve into contradiction. Compounding the challenge was Wall Street's corporate secrecy. Daniel's employer cooperated outwardly, but behind closed doors, executives worried about reputation and investor confidence. Detectives soon discovered requests for building access logs were delayed, redacted, or tied up in layers of legal review. Private security contractors guarded information as if it were trade secrets. The message was clear. Solving the crime mattered, but protecting the institution's image mattered more. Meanwhile, financial institutions applied pressure in subtle but unmistakable ways. Detectives received calls from officials urging swift resolution, warning of panic if the narrative of an unsolved murder gained traction. The implication was unspoken but undeniable. Speed, not accuracy, was the priority. For investigators accustomed to digging patiently into lives, relationships, and motives, the push for a quick answer was suffocating. Physical evidence was scarce. The stairwell yielded blood spatter patterns and broken fragments of Daniel's watch, but no fingerprints of value. The missing wallet suggested robbery, yet no charges were made to his credit cards, no suspicious withdrawals flagged. Forensics searched for DNA, but technology in 2002 lacked the sensitivity later breakthroughs would provide. Samples were inconclusive, degrading under the fluorescent hum of the lab. Detectives followed standard procedure, retrace Daniel's steps, reconstruct his final hours. They interviewed friends, family, colleagues. Some offered useful details. A colleague mentioned a tense phone call days before. A friend recalled Daniel hinting at workplace stress, but nothing crystallized into a coherent theory. Every time momentum built, it stalled against a wall of missing context or institutional obstruction. The frustration grew palpable. Investigators vented privately about wasted time. Files stacked in cluttered offices, while supervisors demanded progress reports for press briefings. Each delay eroded morale. Each dead end widened the gulf between Daniel's grieving family and any semblance of justice. For the Mercers, the system felt impenetrable. Meetings with detectives produced polite assurances but little clarity. Weeks passed, then months. Public interest began to wane, eclipsed by larger headlines in a city still navigating crises. Inside the department, resources shifted elsewhere, caseloads multiplied, and Daniel's murder file began to slide toward the cold case shelf. What began with urgency had curdled into inertia. The official machinery of justice had moved, but not far enough. And beneath the surface, the unanswered question lingered. Was Daniel's killer protected by mere chance, or by the very system meant to expose them. In the absence of answers, suspicion rushed in to fill the void. Wall Street, already a world of whispered deals and backroom speculation, became fertile ground for rumor. Daniel Mercer's murder was the perfect tinderbox, violent, mysterious, unsolved. The first false suspect emerged almost immediately, a colleague who had once clashed with Daniel over a client account. Described as ambitious to the point of arrogance, he was painted by gossipers as jealous, even dangerous. Detectives questioned him thoroughly, and he provided alibis supported by travel records. Yet the stain of suspicion lingered. In the bars around Broad Street, hushed voices connected his name to Daniel's death long after police had cleared him. Then came the whispers of a spurned partner. Daniel's recent breakup had been discreet, but colleagues seized on fragments of overheard conversations, weaving them into a narrative of passion curdled into vengeance. Friends knew this was cruel fiction. Daniel's ex had been hundreds of miles away that night, but the rumor carried a seductive simplicity. It spread through cubicles, elevators, and cocktail hours, reshaping the memory of a woman who had loved Daniel into that of a possible killer. A third theory gained traction in underground circles: the disgruntled employee. Some suggested Daniel had uncovered something illicit, a financial impropriety, an insider scheme, and been silenced. It was a story tailor-made for Wall Street's culture of paranoia, and though investigators found no supporting evidence, it flourished in whispers. Each retelling grew darker, suggesting conspiracies that reached higher and deeper. For Daniel's family, the rumors were a second tragedy. His sister recalled the sting of overhearing strangers speculate about his personal life as though it were an open book. Newspapers, hungry for narrative, flirted with unverified claims, splashing innuendo that blurred fact and fiction. Instead of honoring his memory, the public dissected it, reducing Daniel to a character in competing versions of a crime drama. The corrosive effect spread beyond the family. Colleagues who had once rallied tugged. Ether grew distrustful, eyes narrowing in conference rooms, conversations clipped. Every laugh in a hallway, every drink spilled at a bar could be reframed as evidence of guilt. Reputations eroded quietly, careers suffered collateral damage, and the true killer remained obscured in the fog. By the end of that first year, the case was less about Daniel Mercer than about the stories told in his absence. In a city addicted to speculation, rumor had become both weapon and shield, leaving the truth buried beneath layers of suspicion. In the days following Daniel Mercer's death, the canyons of Wall Street became an unlikely stage for grief. Outside the New York Stock Exchange, a small group gathered with candles, their flames flickering against the harsh glare of trading screens and ticker boards. Colleagues came in tailored suits, their polished shoes standing awkwardly on the uneven cobblestones, while neighbors and friends from beyond the financial world brought flowers, photographs, and handwritten notes. What began as a modest vigil grew steadily, drawing crowds who were searching for meaning in a crime that seemed incomprehensible. For many, Daniel's murder became symbolic. Wall Street represented wealth, power, and impenetrability. Yet here, in the very heart of American finance, someone had been struck down in a stairwell, a place meant to be safe, functional, anonymous. The contrast was jarring. Reporters latched on to the imagery. If violence can breach Wall Street, one wrote, then what corner of the city remains untouchable? The vigil transformed into a statement, a collective acknowledgement that vulnerability did not spare even the most fortified institutions. Still, beneath the glow of candles, fractures emerged. Some attendees spoke passionately about systemic corruption, convinced Daniel's death was tied to secrets buried deep in corporate vaults. They murmured about cover-ups, about police bowing to financial pressure, about truths that would never see daylight. Others bristled at such claims, insisting the tragedy was personal, isolated, an individual crime, not a reflection of the entire financial sector. The disagreements turned quiet gatherings into uneasy ones, where grief intermingled with suspicion. Within the community, these divisions deepened. To Daniel's family, the public discourse often felt intrusive, even exploitative. They wanted their loved one remembered for his kindness and ambition, not as a pawn in debates over Wall Street's moral failings. Yet they also recognized the power of symbolism. The more people spoke Daniel's name, the less chance there was of his case fading into silence. As months passed, the memorials continued, though they shifted in tone. The early vigils had been raw and emotional, voices trembling as hymns rose between skyscrapers. Later ones felt more deliberate, even performative, organized by advocacy groups, attended by politicians, used as platforms to speak on crime, safety, or corporate ethics. Some found comfort in this visibility, believing it kept pressure on investigators. Others resented it, seeing the hijacking of grief for agendas. By the first anniversary, Wall Street itself seemed to hold a scar. The stairwell where Daniel had died was scrubbed, repainted, and quietly reopened, but whispers lingered. Every memorial reminded the city that beneath the glitter of capital markets, there had been blood. For New Yorkers still rebuilding their sense of resilience after 9/11, Daniel's murder became another wound, one that refused to close neatly. The community mourned, debated, and fractured, bound together only by one inescapable truth. A man had been taken violently in a place thought untouchable, and the shadow of that act lingered long after the candles burned out. For a time, hope clung to the idea that science would provide clarity. Detectives rushed samples from the stairwell, traces of blood, fragments of hair, smudged fingerprints, to the crime lab. DNA testing was heralded as the breakthrough tool of the new century, but weeks of waiting led only to disappointment. The partial profiles were too degraded, too contaminated by the hundreds of people who had used the stairwell daily. The promise of certainty dissolved into inconclusive reports, stacked neatly in manila folders. Surveillance footage, too, offered more torment than relief. At first, investigators believed the building's cameras might hold the key, a figure trailing Daniel, an unexplained shadow on a landing. Yet the tapes from that night had been poorly archived, transferred to degraded formats, frames skipping in crucial moments. What remained was a blurred mosaic, images that teased but refused to speak. Detectives replayed them endlessly, straining for recognition, only to admit defeat. Attention turned to suspects. Each lead seemed, for a moment, unshakably solid. A colleague who had argued with Daniel the week before, a maintenance worker with access to the stairwells, a visitor who couldn't explain his presence in the building that night. Each was scrutinized, interrogated, cross-checked, and each, in time, produced alibis that held firm under pressure. Credit card receipts, time-stamped subway swipes, corroborating witnesses, all airtight. The cumulative effect was crushing. Detectives felt themselves circling the same drain, their case files thickening while progress thinned. For Daniel's family, each new headline promising breakthrough evidence only to collapse into silence was its own fresh wound. Friends who had once spoken eagerly with police grew cautious, even skeptical, their faith eroded by repetition without resolution. By the second year, the pattern was unmistakable. Every apparent step forward ended in retreat. Leads that had once glowed with possibility sputtered into darkness. The stairwell killing remained an unsolved riddle, its clues fragile, its answers elusive. What had begun as a case of urgency was now quietly edging toward limbo, leaving behind a trail of exhaustion, disappointment, and a city weary of waiting for justice. Time became both enemy and accomplice in Daniel Mercer's murder. The first year had carried urgency, the second a stubborn resolve. By the third, momentum gave way to inertia. Detectives shuffled between cases, promotions came, retirements followed. The Mercer file, once spread across desks, annotated with fresh notes, was eventually reduced to a cardboard box, its label fading under layers of dust. Evidence languished in storage, photographs yellowed, videotapes sat unwatched, and forensic reports that had once seemed cutting-edge grew obsolete. Detectives who had vowed to solve the case passed it along like an unwanted inheritance to younger colleagues who, already burdened with new caseloads, had little time to devote to an old mystery that yielded nothing but frustration. For Daniel's family, however, the case was never old. Each year, the anniversary brought renewed grief, a wound torn open by ritual. His sister lit candles in her queen's apartment, whispering promises that she would never let him be forgotten. His parents mailed letters to Precinct Command, begging for updates, though the replies became increasingly perfunctory. No new developments at this time. The Mercers lived suspended between hope and despair, clinging to the idea that somewhere, someone still cared. Wall Street, meanwhile, healed in the only way it knew, through momentum. New deals replaced old ones. Fresh recruits filled desks once occupied by those who had mourned Daniel. Colleagues who had once attended vigils eventually stopped mentioning his name. His death became a cautionary tale told to interns. Then even that faded. A decade later, many working in the same buildings had never even heard of him. The city itself seemed complicit in forgetting. The stairwell where Daniel's body was found was repainted, its lights upgraded, its history erased by renovations. The building's tenants changed. No plaque, no memorial marked what had happened there. On Wall Street, space was too valuable for ghosts. Media interest dwindled as well. Reporters who had once hounded the family moved on to fresher tragedies. Occasionally, a newspaper might run a short retrospective piece. Unsolved a year later, family pleads for justice 5 years on, but each was shorter, buried deeper in the pages, until eventually, there were none. Daniel's story slipped from the city's crowded memory, eclipsed by newer crimes and bigger headlines. Yet silence is not the same as peace. For those closest to him, the absence of answers was its own kind of violence. His sister spoke of dreams where Daniel appeared, reaching for her, but always retreating into shadow before she could grasp him. Friends carried private guilt, wondering if they had missed some sign, some warning. The cold case became less a mystery than a specter, haunting those who remembered, invisible to those who did not. By the 15th year, the Mercer case existed in a kind of suspended twilight, officially unsolved, unofficially abandoned, a box in storage, a family unwilling to forget, a city content to move on. What had once been a wound became a scar, faint, overlooked, but still tender to the touch. It seemed Daniel Mercer's story might remain there forever, consigned to silence. By the 2010s, Daniel Mercer's murder had become a ghost story in New York's financial district, remembered dimly if at all, but ghosts have a way of stirring when least expected. What had once been left to dust and silence was about to be drawn back into the light. The change came not from inside the NYPD, but from outside pressure. Daniel's sister, who had carried the burden of memory for over a decade, never stopped writing letters. Every commissioner, every mayoral administration, every politician who promised to value justice received her appeals. Most answered with silence, a few with polite deferrals. But persistence has its own gravity, and in time, it began to pull attention back toward the forgotten file. Journalists, too, played a role. A small but relentless cadre of crime reporters had kept tabs on cold cases, and the Mercer murder had an irresistible symmetry: Wall Street, wealth, vulnerability, mystery. In 2014, one such reporter published a long-form piece titled "The Stairwell That Time Forgot." The article wove together interviews with Daniel's family, surviving detectives, and former colleagues. It painted the case not as a relic, but as a still open wound, and the story struck a chord with readers who had never heard of Mercer before. At the same time, advances in forensic science were rewriting what was possible. DNA testing that had once required large, clean samples could now extract profiles from trace amounts, even degraded fragments. Cold case units across the country were suddenly reopening files thought unsolvable. In New York, a dedicated task force was formed to apply these new methods to cases like Mercer's. When his box of evidence was pulled from storage, it was like opening a time capsule. Old swabs, fingernail scrapings, and fibers long deemed useless were suddenly candidates for re-examination. Detectives who inherited the case were cautious, but quietly optimistic. They knew how cruel hope could be, how often it fizzled under scrutiny. Still, the idea that technology might succeed where human memory had failed was intoxicating. They submitted the samples to modern labs, waiting for results that might take months. For the Mercer family, word of the renewed testing was both relief and torment. At last, there was movement. Yet every phone call from a detective triggered heart-stopping anxiety. Daniel's sister described it as living with the possibility of resurrection. she lit her annual candle that year with a new prayer: that technology, indifferent and methodical, might deliver what people had not. Hope was fragile but unmistakable. Where once there had been silence, now there was talk again. Former colleagues reached out to the family, journalists checked in more frequently, and whispers circulated in precinct hallways that something might be coming on the Mercer file. Even within the cold case unit, detectives admitted to feeling a spark. The city had changed enormously since 2002, but the questions remained the same. Who had stalked Daniel Mercer into that stairwell? Why had he been silenced so brutally? And could the fragments left behind, once dismissed, finally reveal a name? For the first time in over a decade, the case felt alive. The candlelight vigil no longer flickered against a wall of silence. It glowed against the possibility of justice. The city that had forgotten was on the verge of remembering, and the Mercer family, long stranded in limbo, dared to believe that answers might finally be within reach. The breakthrough came from something so small it was almost overlooked: a single fiber, preserved on a swab from Daniel Mercer's shirt collar. In 2002, the item had been collected as a matter of routine, bagged, labeled, and tucked into evidence storage. Analysts at the time dismissed it as too degraded, its trace material insufficient for meaningful results. But in the hands of a modern lab, armed with technology that could reconstruct genetic profiles from even the faintest fragments, that sliver became a lifeline. The retesting process stretched over weeks, each stage meticulous. Technicians in sterile gowns and gloves carefully reopened the sealed evidence bag, documenting every movement with cameras and chain of custody logs. The fiber was bathed, amplified, and coaxed into yielding its secrets. Machines hummed and clicked, reading sequences invisible to the naked eye. At first, results were murky, as if the past itself resisted being pulled forward. But with each round of amplification, a profile began to emerge, fragile but distinct. Detectives who had worked the Mercer case for years gathered anxiously around conference calls with the lab. The voices of analysts came through with professional calm, yet even they could not mask the undercurrent of excitement. Forensic science was not about theatrics, but there was a palpable sense that something extraordinary was happening, that the silence of 12 years might finally break. And then, one morning, the call that changed everything. "We've got a partial match," the analyst said, and the words landed like thunder. A match. Those 4 letters held the weight of 2 decades. Detectives froze, notebooks suspended in midair, hearts pounding. The name that appeared on their screens was not a stranger plucked from obscurity, but someone hiding in plain sight, a figure who had brushed close to the case years before, but slipped through the cracks. The shock was twofold: the confirmation that Daniel's killer had been within reach all along, and the chilling realization that this person had lived free, unencumbered for years, while the family mourned and the city forgot. The lab confirmed the result, rerunning the sample multiple times to eliminate doubt. Each test came back the same. What once had been uncertainty was now clarity, as crisp as the printout of numbers aligning on the page. Detectives, hardened by years of disappointments, allowed themselves cautious elation. One veteran described it later as feeling the ground shift under my feet. When the news reached Daniel's family, it was like hearing his voice again after years of silence. His sister wept openly on the phone with detectives, her words tumbling out. "So you know? You really know?" For so long, anniversaries had meant only unanswered questions. Now, at last, there was an answer, a name that could be spoken aloud. The ripple extended beyond the family. Journalists who had covered the case since its inception received leaks that something was stirring. Whispers spread quickly. Mercer's case was no longer cold. Within precinct walls, younger detectives marveled at the persistence of science, while older ones shook their heads, haunted by how close they had once been. The reveal was cinematic in its timing. Screens in the lab glowed with sequences of letters, DNA codes spelling out the past in stark precision. Detectives in dimly lit offices leaned forward over reports, realizing that the lone, forgotten fiber, dismissed, neglected, nearly discarded, had become the fulcrum on which the entire case now turned. Years of frustration flipped in an instant into revelation. What followed was a flurry of motion. Case files long dormant were reopened, interviews from 2002 revisited with new urgency. Every loose thread was examined in the context of the name now highlighted in red. The sense of paralysis that had defined the case dissolved into movement. For the first time in over a decade, momentum surged like electricity through the halls of justice. For Daniel's family, the discovery was not closure, but ignition. They knew the path ahead. Arrest, trial, the long grind of legal reckoning would be fraught. But this moment, this match, was undeniable proof that he had not been forgotten, that justice had not abandoned them completely. The candlelight vigils, the letters, the years of waiting had not been in vain. In a city where stories often vanish beneath the weight of new headlines, Daniel Mercer's name returned, not as a fading memory, but as a case alive again, reborn in the glow of a single DNA strand. Once the DNA match was confirmed, secrecy was no longer an option. The NYPD, long accused of neglecting the Mercer case, was forced to go public. The investigation was officially reopened. The announcement hit headlines within hours, reigniting a firestorm of attention. Newspapers ran bold banners, Wall Street stairwell murder, back in spotlight, and television anchors revisited footage of Daniel Mercer's funeral, contrasting it with footage of the bustling financial district in 2015. The media frenzy was immediate and relentless. Cameras camped outside precinct doors, reporters thrust microphones toward anyone even remotely connected to Mercer. Former colleagues found themselves revisited by journalists eager for sound bites. Old witnesses, once weary of telling their stories, were pulled back into the narrative, their memories tested under the glare of renewed scrutiny. For detectives, the DNA match was a beginning, not an end. They understood that forensic evidence alone would not carry the case to trial. It needed context, corroboration, and airtight linkage to the night of the murder, and so the old files were reopened with a sharper eye. Witness statements were cross-checked against the timeline suggested by the DNA hit. Inconsistencies that once seemed minor were now critical fault lines. Former suspects, cleared years before, were re-examined. Detectives tracked down alibis that had once seemed watertight, but now, under the microscope of modern investigative techniques, revealed subtle cracks. A subway swipe record once thought definitive was re-evaluated. A restaurant receipt was checked against surveillance cameras that hadn't been reviewed before. Every assumption was challenged, every certainty destabilized. New witnesses emerged as well. Time, ironically, loosened tongues. Individuals who had remained silent in 2002, out of fear, loyalty, or indifference, were now more willing to speak. A building employee, retired and no longer bound by corporate pressure, described tensions he'd witnessed between Daniel and a particular coworker. A former intern, long dismissed as peripheral, recalled an unusual sighting in the stairwell the week of the murder. Each fragment added weight to the growing case file. Momentum built with remarkable speed. Detectives who had once spoken of Mercer's case in hushed tones now carried it like a banner. Press conferences crackled with urgency, the city demanding to know how such a brutal crime had remained unsolved for so long. The answer lay not just in the evidence, but in the cultural moment. A city hungry for justice, a police department eager to prove its resolve, and a family whose persistence had forced the world to remember. The reopening of the case felt less like a continuation than a rebirth. After 13 years of silence, the investigation was once again alive, public, scrutinized, and moving at full force. Somewhere in that whirl of interviews, re-examined alibis, and newfound testimony, detectives believed the truth was finally within reach. The revelation came not with a whisper, but with a thunderclap. After weeks of renewed investigation, detectives finally announced the name, the man tied by DNA and corroborating evidence to Daniel Mercer's 2002 murder. He was not an unknown assailant, not a faceless predator from the streets. He was someone from within Mercer's world, someone shockingly close. The press conference froze the city. On the screen behind the police commissioner, the face of the accused appeared, Jonathan Hale, a colleague who had once been considered a friend. Hale had attended Mercer's wedding. He had toasted him at corporate dinners. For years he had walked freely through the same financial halls where Mercer had once worked, carrying himself as a respected member of the community. To hear his name now attached to such violence sent ripples of disbelief through Wall Street and far beyond. The betrayal was almost unbearable. How could a man who had offered condolences at Mercer's funeral also be the one who took his life? The answer, investigators explained, lay in jealousy and simmering professional rivalry. Evidence revealed a bitter undercurrent. Mercer's rapid ascent at the firm had outpaced Hale's, sparking resentment that festered beneath their polished handshakes. The DNA matched Hale to a scrap of blood found on Mercer's cuff, once overlooked. Additional witness testimony now placed Hale in the stairwell that night. Piece by piece, the picture grew undeniable. The community reeled. At first, many refused to believe it. Hale had been known as reliable, even charming. To some, he was a mentor. To others, a peer they trusted with financial dealings worth millions. Former co-workers spoke in stunned tones, recounting nights spent with Hale over drinks, never suspecting the darkness beneath his calm surface. In bars across Lower Manhattan, conversations turned to disbelief, then anger. If someone like Hale could harbor such malice, what did that say about the culture they worked in every day? National headlines exploded. Wall Street murder solved, friend turned killer. 2 decades of lies. The story wasn't just about a murder anymore. It was about betrayal woven into the fabric of a world that prided itself on trust, loyalty, and brotherhood among colleagues. Commentators asked how Hale had managed to walk free for 20 years, building a life, a career, even a family, while Mercer's loved ones carried grief without answers. For Mercer's family, the reveal was both a relief and a devastation. Relief that the waiting was finally over, that the faceless shadow tormenting their nights now had a name. Devastation because that name belonged to someone they had once welcomed into their home. Old photographs surfaced of Mercer and Hale standing shoulder to shoulder at company events, smiling as though nothing divided them. Those images, now seared with irony, spread across television screens and front pages like cruel reminders. In the days that followed, the case dominated every news cycle. Analysts dissected the evidence, replaying the story of the jealous co-worker who became a murderer. The public devoured it, not simply because of the crime, but because it struck at something deeper. The fear that the greatest dangers are not always strangers in the dark, but those we think we know best. The gut punch of the revelation lingered long after the press conference ended. The city and the nation stared into the unsettling truth that Daniel Mercer had not fallen to a random act of violence, but to betrayal from within his own circle. It was not just a crime solved. It was a wound reopened, a trust shattered, a truth almost too painful to bear. The arrest came at dawn, a quiet suburban street broken by flashing red and blue lights. Neighbors emerged in slippers and robes as federal marshals and NYPD officers surrounded Jonathan Hale's home. He opened the door in disbelief, blinking against the beams of tactical flashlights. For years, he had walked as a free man, his secret buried under layers of dust and bureaucracy. Now, with wrists bound in cold steel, he was dragged into the blinding light of long-delayed justice. News cameras swarmed the precinct within hours. Hale's face, once associated with respectability and success, was splashed across every broadcast. Headlines called him the colleague killer, a man who smiled in the boardroom while carrying the weight of blood on his conscience. The city, and the nation, was transfixed. The first court appearance was electric. Family members of Daniel Mercer filled the gallery, their grief sharpened into fury. Hale, suited and calm, stood beside his attorneys, denying everything. The charge, second-degree murder. The evidence, a DNA match from the cuff of Mercer's shirt, reanalyzed with cutting-edge technology, paired with corroborating witness testimony that placed him near the stairwell on the night of the crime. The prosecution laid out their case in bold strokes. They argued jealousy had driven Hale to snap, luring Mercer into the stairwell under the pretense of a private meeting. Once there, prosecutors claimed, Hale struck with ruthless precision, leaving Mercer to bleed before calmly walking away. The motive, it was envy, opportunity, and betrayal. They painted Hale as a man whose charm masked insecurity, whose ambition curdled into rage when Mercer's career trajectory outpaced his own. But the defense wasted no time striking back. Their strategy was clear: discredit the evidence, sow doubt, exploit the 2 decades of silence that had followed the crime. They attacked the DNA testing, calling it contaminated, questioning the chain of custody from 2002. How could anyone be sure that the tiny bloodstain had not been compromised after sitting in a dusty evidence locker for years? They pointed to the fallibility of memory, reminding the jury that witness statements had been reshaped by time, rumor, and media frenzy. Hale's lawyers also worked to humanize him, presenting him as a family man, a father, a community volunteer. They insisted the prosecution was railroading an innocent man simply to close an embarrassing cold case. Jonathan Hale has lived openly, honorably for 20 years, one attorney declared. Does that sound like the life of a murderer? The tension was unbearable for Mercer's family. Each day in court forced them to relive the night of his death. Photographs of the crime scene flashed across projector screens: the stairwell, the blood, Mercer's crumpled body. His sister wept openly, unable to look. His parents sat rigid, hands clasped, enduring each painful detail with quiet determination. For them, justice was not abstract. It was the restoration of Daniel's stolen dignity. Reporters dissected every motion, every whispered exchange between attorneys. Cable news replayed courtroom sketches, feeding a public appetite for drama. Commentators compared the case to the O.J. Simpson trial, predicting endless debate about forensic science and the reliability of old evidence. The courtroom became not just a battleground for truth, but a stage for America's conflict, in faith in its justice system. The judge, weary of theatrics, repeatedly reminded both sides to stick to facts. Still, the legal chess match consumed the courtroom. Each cross-examination became a duel. A forensic expert explained how modern DNA technology could isolate profiles with unprecedented accuracy, countering claims of contamination. The defense retorted with their own specialists, citing studies of lab errors and mishandled samples. Through it all, Hale maintained an unsettling composure. He scribbled notes, whispered to his lawyers, and occasionally looked back toward Mercer's family. The coldness of his gaze left them shaken. Was this the same man who once shared dinners and laughter with them? Or had that always been a mask? Weeks dragged into months, every hearing another reminder that justice delayed could still be fragile, uncertain. The jury watched intently, caught between the clean science of DNA and the murky uncertainties raised by the defense. In that tension lay the fate of Jonathan Hale and the long-awaited resolution for the Mercer family. The trial had not yet reached its climax, but already the confrontation between truth and denial, science and doubt, grief and betrayal had etched itself into the city's consciousness. Wall Street had long prided itself on numbers that didn't lie. Now all that mattered was whether 12 jurors would believe the numbers in blood. The verdict arrived on a quiet afternoon. The jury filed back into the courtroom, faces taut with the gravity of their decision. The air was so tense it seemed to hum, every shuffle of paper amplified, every breath caught in anticipation. When the foreperson rose and spoke the words, "guilty of second-degree murder," the silence cracked open. Daniel Mercer's family clutched one another, tears spilling freely. It was relief, yes, but also the sharp resurgence of grief, as though the finality of the verdict confirmed once more what had been stolen from them. For 2 decades they had lived in limbo, burdened by rumors, suspicion, and silence. Now, the truth was written into the record, undeniable. Justice had not come quickly, but it had come. Jonathan Hale stood stone-faced as the verdict was read, betraying no emotion. Some had expected outrage, others a collapse into remorse, but there was nothing. Only the stillness of a man whose double life had finally ended. The judge swiftly moved to sentencing, emphasizing the betrayal and brutality of the crime. This was not only an act of violence, he said, but a profound violation of trust. Hale was handed a sentence of 25 years to life. For the Mercer family, the sentence was both everything and not enough. It offered accountability but could never return the laughter of family dinners, the phone calls on birthdays, the future Daniel had been building. His mother later said, It's like finally closing a door we never wanted opened in the first place. His sister described it as carrying a scar that would always ache, even if it no longer bled. Outside the courthouse, the community gathered. Reporters angled for quotes, but most people spoke in hushed tones, mindful of the weight of the moment. Some saw the conviction as a victory for persistence, proof that cold cases could be solved and that justice, however delayed, was still possible. Others lingered on the haunting reality that it had taken 20 years of pressure, advancements in technology, and unyielding family devotion to bring about a resolution that should have come so much sooner. In Lower Manhattan, vigils were once again held near the stock exchange, but this time candles burned with a different light, not only mourning but release. For colleagues and friends, the sentencing allowed them to remember Daniel not as a victim frozen in tragedy, but as the vibrant man he had been. Healing began, uneven and fragile, but real. The trial had ended, the sentence delivered, yet closure was never absolute. For the Mercers, for New York, the memory of the crime remained a reminder that even in the heart of power, humanity is vulnerable. The skyscrapers still gleamed, but behind their windows, people carried stories of loss, resilience, and endurance. Justice had spoken. The scars remained. The story of Daniel Mercer's murder is more than a tale of individual tragedy and eventual justice. It is also a window into the systemic failures that allowed a brutal crime to remain unresolved for nearly 2 decades, despite occurring in one of the most surveilled and scrutinized districts in America. The lessons it leaves behind are sobering. First, bureaucracy proved to be both shield and obstacle. In the immediate aftermath, investigators were caught between genuine effort and the inertia of red tape. Wall Street institutions, desperate to preserve an image of stability in a city still reeling from 9/11, leaned on police for discretion. That discretion quickly shaded into opacity. Access to security footage was delayed, corporate records were sealed, and interviews were softened under the weight of legal departments. Detectives found themselves hindered not just by the complexity of the crime, but by the protective walls of corporate influence. Justice was slowed by paperwork and priority setting in which reputation often trumped truth. Second, the limitations of forensic science at the time left investigators without the tools we now take for granted. In 2002, DNA testing was far less sensitive, unable to reliably analyze trace samples or distinguish complex mixtures. Evidence that could have yielded answers sat dormant in storage boxes, effectively invisible until technology advanced. Each year that passed was not just time lost, but opportunity squandered, families waiting while progress lagged behind the needs of justice. The Mercer case demonstrates that a system's ability to solve crimes is not only about human will, but about investment in science, infrastructure, and foresight. Third, the case highlights the corrosive impact of rumor and misplaced suspicion when investigations falter. In the absence of clear answers, gossip filled the void. Colleagues whispered about rivals, acquaintances, even Daniel's own friends. Reputations were stained, relationships destroyed, all because the system could not deliver clarity. The burden fell hardest on the family, who endured not only their grief, but also the cruel weight of speculation. It is a reminder that when justice is delayed, communities fracture, and wounds spread far beyond the immediate circle of loss. But there are lessons in resilience, too. The Mercer family's persistence kept the case alive long after it had been relegated to the cold case files. They wrote letters, called officials, spoke to journalists, and refused to let their son's memory vanish. Their devotion demonstrates the power of families to hold institutions accountable, to demand attention when systems prefer silence. In the end, it was their refusal to forget that aligned with advancing technology and renewed police focus, breaking the stalemate. For law enforcement, the Mercer case stands as a call to rethink priorities. Cold cases must not be treated as archival curiosities, but as ongoing responsibilities. Each box of evidence represents not just data, but a family's unanswered questions. Investment in forensic research, digital storage, and transparent collaboration with corporations is not optional, it is essential. For the justice system, the lesson is stark. Delay does not erase responsibility, it only compounds harm. Ultimately, the Mercer case reminds us that behind every statistic, every headline, lies a human story waiting to be honored. Justice may falter, but memory does not have to. Families, communities, and society at large bear the responsibility of insisting that no life, no matter how overshadowed by power or circumstance, can simply vanish into silence. Daniel Mercer's story is not just the account of a life stolen, but of a community forever changed. He was a son, a brother, a colleague, and a friend, a man with ambitions, humor, and humanity. For 20 years, his name risked fading into the background noise of Wall Street, overshadowed by deadlines and deals. Yet because his family refused to surrender to silence, his story endured, and today it stands as a testament to the power of persistence. The decades of waiting remind us that justice, while often delayed, must never be forgotten. Families like the Mercers shoulder unimaginable weight, year after year of unanswered questions, of rumors and shadows. And yet they continue, driven by love stronger than time. Their resilience teaches us that even in the darkest corridors of bureaucracy and indifference, the human spirit can refuse to let truth die. As we close this chapter, let us carry forward Daniel's memory, not as a victim frozen in tragedy, but as a life that mattered, whose story demanded to be heard. Every case we revisit, every coal file reopened, is another reminder that silence should never have the final word. If stories like Daniel's move you, if you believe memory is itself a form of justice, join us. Subscribe, share, and stand with families who continue the fight. Because keeping these stories alive is not only about the past, it is about ensuring that no life is ever forgotten again.